welcome to the December edition of the Cafe Seminar Series. I hope that you are all doing well despite the ongoing health crisis. So in recent days, we've had positive news on the vaccine and we had less encouraging news on contamination. And so I'm not sure, which type of news I should most focus on. But luckily, this is precisely the type of question that will be addressed in today's seminar. So we are really delighted that Ester Faia from Goethe University, Frankfurt, has accepted to present her paper, as you can see on the screen, Biases in Information Selection and Processing, Survey Evidence from the Pandemic. It is joined with Andreas Fuster, Vincenzo Pezone, and Basit Zafar. We're also thrilled that Michael Thaler from Princeton will be giving the discussion. So thanks, Michael, for starting your day early to join a European seminar. Esther, the screen is yours.
Thanks a lot. Kim, Raman, Roland, thanks a lot for inviting me to this very interesting seminar and for giving us the opportunity to present this work on biases in information selection and processes, survey evidence from the pandemic. I had the privilege to work with this terrific group of co-authors, and we very much enjoyed and put a lot of passion into this work. So I hope you're gonna like it. So it's an experiment. The fundamental goal and question is to understand belief formation, which I guess, we all agree it's a fundamental part of economics and social science. Without that, it's difficult to understand how equilibrium are formed. And we focus on, of course, there is also increasing agreement that belief formation has biases of several sources, some genuine mistakes, some more devious ones. But one way to measure those biases is to do experiments. And we are focusing on a sort of novel but growing methodology, which is information experiment. Two features which are very novel to our setup are the endogenous choice of information and the randomization. So we allow our respondents to choose the signals that they wish to consume, and particularly in this case, it is newspaper articles. And then very importantly, and as you will see, as I will argue in a moment, this is very important to measure the type of biases we are interested in, which is motivated beliefs. And the second important novelty is that we randomize the assignments of these article sources to the respondents, some of them receiving the desired ones, some of them receiving the non-desired ones. And this creates the sort of casual experimental setting that allows us to measure precisely how beliefs are updated differentially across different respondents. Our work develops in two surveys. The first one is focused on individual motivated beliefs. So we randomize the assignment of news articles. I will describe the design in a moment. The second one is an extension of this to source dependence. So there we randomize revealing the source or not to the respondents, and we try to, what we are trying to understand is to whether learning that the source is close to your own thinking makes you, or far from your own thinking makes you actually revise the choice that you would have done without knowing the source. And as I will argue also in a minute, it is very important that we conduct this during a large shock, and particularly a health shock. So the area we're interested in is the area of motivated beliefs that Michael Thaler is contributing a lot, massively. This is a very, a growing and important area. Let me first define it so that you will understand what is different compared to other type of beliefs. So it's biased reasoning to produce justification, self-serving justification, or make decisions, desired decisions rather than those that accurately reflect evidence. So contrary to the entire area of genuine mistakes, constraints on information processing, here it's really intentional. So there is an intentional component. And the reason for which they are very important, at least in my views, but I guess in the views of everybody, is because if there are incentives and not genuine mistakes behind it, then there is a role for policymakers. So policymakers can tweak with communication those incentives in the right direction. So there is a role for nudging. Now, there are several variants of these motivated beliefs, and you will see that we are going to confirm one particular one, which is also the most nuanced. So the basic ones is wishful thinking, optimism, or self-deception. They're more or less the same. They basically say that, I mean, here are some papers. Now, in the paper, we have lots of other citations. So if you don't see your paper cited here, probably it is in the paper itself. And if you don't see it cited there as well, just mention it to us. So this wishful thinking or optimism is basically the consistent choice of signals that are optimistic or that confirm your talents somehow. There is another variant of it, confirmatory biases, which was introduced by Rabin and Schrag in 1999, that is more nuanced, meaning that it says that independently of whether you are an optimist or a pessimist, you're going to choose signals which are close to your prior. And so, I mean, if you are a pessimist, you might keep selecting depressing sort of signals. But the very important thing is the asymmetric updating. So please keep in mind this asymmetric updating because it's a key part of our design. So respondents are going to select signals which are close to their prior and overweight them, and they're going to underweight signals that are far from their prior. The extension of this to group thinking. So your beliefs are going to be, your desired beliefs are going to be amplified when you are in a group that you have been choosing. And so, I mean, this goes into partisan polarization, media polarization, where our second survey contribute to. So you can think of this as, you know, an exacerbation of the motivated beliefs when you are in a group that works as an echo chamber. Now, behind all of this, this theory has an important component, which is the fact that there is endogenous acquisition of information. And, already there is expanding work mentioning that all these information experiments, they need to allow for the endogenous choice, because just giving signals without knowing whether this is the desired or not does not allow to really understand why belief updating is done in one way or the other. Why did we do it in the pandemic? It wasn't just to fill our time, which was actually an important component of it, but there are a number of reasons. So, I mean, our was a broader question, and probably many of us had already this thing in mind for quite some time. The reason for taking the chance of doing it during the pandemic are several. So first of all, I mean, when there is a large shock, there is high uncertainty and no objective anchoring. So even the experts at times didn't have very much clue about what was going on. And it is also a salient event. It's something that we all fear. And so we are hunger for news. We want to consume news, and we want to consume news that make us feel well in general, and very likely making us feel well means to be close to our priors. It's a large health shock, and Benabou and Tirol have already argued that in health events tend to foster denial, which is one variant of motivated beliefs. Most importantly, I mean, the pandemic was about some intended behavior, which we are also going to measure. I mean, we have had several months of economists and virologists running CEPR model that predict infection, but where there are no beliefs. So agents seem to be getting in contact with each other, but they don't seem to update their beliefs about what is going on. So in general, even if we want to understand intended behavior and infection spread, this is also quite important to understand first how people think about it. And at last, we know that during large shocks, that there is increasing, I mean, at least there seems to be increasing polarization. I mean, we have experienced this in history, and probably this is going to be true now as well. And not only partisan polarization, but also media polarization. Okay, so let me jump head to head with the description of the first experimental design. So the first survey was, remember, this was intended to measure individual motivated beliefs. So we have a representative sample on age, education, gender, and geography of 2,000 US households. The survey was designed by us, but was conducted by Qualtrics in May 2020. We collect demographic. This is the usual steps. I mean, here we take pretty standard questions from ACS, CPS. Then we solicit priors, both based, I mean, about pandemic's topic on health and economy domain, and we solicit both point estimates and probability distributions. Then we propose 4 headlines to our respondents, 2 in the economy domain, 2 in the health domain. But most importantly, the headlines, which I've put there in the slides for you, they differ markedly in their tone. So they are one optimistic and one pessimistic. We checked before by testing them in pilot or in Mechanical Turk that the headlines are not differing markedly in other dimensions. So we checked that there was no one particular headline that was catchier than another. But we want them to differ markedly in their tone, because this is exactly what we want to check, whether a pessimist is going to choose a pessimistic headline and whether he's going to update more if he receives his desired headline. Okay, so we allow them to choose those headlines. I'm going to show you in a moment in a schematic the exact timing of events, and then we're going to randomize. So randomization means that some of them receive their preferred tone headline, and some of them randomly they receive the non-preferred tone. After that, we solicit posterior, and we measure the differential updating between the ones that receive the desired headline and the ones that receive the non-desired one. And at last, we solicit a number of policy preferences, intended behavior, but most important, incentivized behavioral measures. So we ask them whether they want to donate money to the WHO or FreedomWorks. Those are two organizations that differ markedly. WHO probably more appealing to pessimists because it favors lockdown, and FreedomWorks probably more appealing to optimists because it fosters, it favors no lockdown and no measures, no restrictions. And then we also ask them whether they want to advertise the article on Facebook or on other websites. And the important thing of having these incentivized behavioral measures is that we want to make sure that the way they behave, it's consistent with what they declared before. Now, let me summarize a little bit more slowly this in a schematic, which probably would make it even more clear. So the timing is as follows. First, we solicit the priors after asking for demographics. Then we let them choose one of the four headlines according to the domain, either health or economy. And by the way, the headlines are proposed randomly. Then we let them choose the tone, optimistic or pessimistic. Then we randomize. And so half of them randomly gets the preferred article, half of them gets the non-preferred articles, and then we solicit posterior. Now, let me tell you each part of the design, why was it done in this way? So first of all, as I said before, to measure motivated belief that I have a component of incentive, we need to have endogenous choice of the articles. However, endogenous choice of the articles might be, part also, might be part of the explanation also of other theories like rational inattention. The other distinguished features of motivated beliefs and confirmatory biases is the asymmetric updating that I told you before. And the reason for which we randomize is precisely to have part of the sample that receives the desired signals and part of the sample that receives the non-desired one. And then at last, as I said before, the reason for asking incentivized behavior is for soliciting incentivized behavior is to confirm what we saw in the declaration. All right, before going to the results, let me also briefly say that, of course, we checked that our sample was reasonable. And by reasonable, I mean that all demographics were going to predict the article choice in the direction that we expected. So for instance, all people with underlying health condition or that got unemployed tend to be more worried and then tend to choose the pessimistic article. Female, as we know, they tend to be more worried. Liberals, they also tend to be more worried, and higher willingness to take risk and low patience implies less worrying. Surprisingly enough, higher age is negatively correlated with worried, but this was noted also in a recent paper by Bordalo, Gennaioli, and Schleifer. Now, let me guide you through the results. What I'm going to do is, number one, I'm going to check whether priors are going to predict the choice of the article, both in terms of domain and in terms of the tone. And second, I'm going to check whether, once we randomize, whether there is asymmetric updated. And at last, we're going to check whether all the intended behaviors and the incentivized behavior are going to be consistent with our previous results. Okay, so table one, here we have the dependent variable is the choice of the health domain. And and here we have a number of proxies for the priors. Okay, we collect together all the priors questions related to probability of debt, probability of unemployment, and so on. And we collect them together in different ways. So here is the combined worries about economy and health. Here is whether you are more worried about health minus the worries that you have in the economy. Here is the principal component. And here is lockdown support, which we expect to be correlated with you being pessimistic. Okay, so all of those measures capture some dimensions of being pessimistic up front. And what we see is that all consistently predict that respondents are going to choose a pessimistic health article, particularly if they are more worried about health, they are more likely to choose the health pessimistic article. Okay, so this is one evidence in the direction of saying that beliefs, I mean, the choice of the article, the choice of consuming certain information doesn't really depend on who you are, what is your education, what is your expertise, but it's going to depend really on how you feel about the pandemic at the beginning. Now, we zoom deeper into that and we ask whether the choice of the pessimistic article in any domain, so the first 4 columns is health, the second 4 columns is economy. So the choice of the pessimistic article depends again on your priors, okay? So whether you were worried altogether, whether, I mean, the principal component of all your worries, beliefs, what the principal component captures, and whether you supported lockdown. And again, strikingly, all those pessimistic priors have a very high predictive power, meaning that, I mean, the coefficients are all significant and they are very high. So if you are more worried at the beginning, you tend to choose the more pessimistic article. In this case, we also see complementarities between health and economy worries. So we don't see the so-called trade-off between being more worried about one or the other. Generally speaking, people that are worried, they tend to be equally worried in all dimensions, and they tend to choose the article that is close to their prior beliefs. You can see here, you can see this visually here, okay? So this is a non-parametric test. Where we divide our distribution of respondents in quintiles, going from the lowest worry to the highest worry, okay? And the red one is the one that shows the economy headline, and the green one is the one that have chosen the health headline. And what you see is that the more people are worried, the more respondents are worried, and the higher is the likelihood that they tend to choose the pessimistic article in either of the 2 dimensions. Okay, it's equally so in either dimension. Okay, now here comes the crucial part. So here comes really the fun of it. So here we randomize, and so after respondents have chosen their article, some of them they receive the desired ones, and some of them they receive the non-desired ones. So here the question is, if respondents have received a signal that they like, whether they are going to overshoot, to overweight, to update even more in the direction of that signals, as opposed to the ones that receive the non-desired signal. And indeed, this is the case. So the dependent variable here is every time in a different column, the difference between the posterior and the priors, okay? So here is the differential probability that you are attributing to the fact that unemployment will be above 20%. And here is the difference between the posterior and the prior, okay? And the regressor of interest is the interaction term between you having chosen the pessimistic article and you having received the article that you really liked, okay? And what you see here is that this positively predict the fact that you are going to, if you were worried at the beginning, you're going to be even more worried afterwards, okay? So there is a positive increase in the worry probability that is significantly affected by the interaction term. So, I mean, this figure is always hard to comment, but let me try very briefly and very quickly. So here, I mean, let's focus on one panel. So here is, for instance, it's again the non-parametric test. So it's equivalent to the table you saw before, but it's just, you know, the non-parametric regression. So focus on the first one. So here is the people that have chosen the article in the health domain. Okay, and here is how they revise the probability of that. What you see, I mean, somehow they were a bit optimistic about this here. Okay, so they assigned, they revised downwards. However, beyond the trend, which is the same for everybody, what matters for us is the relative update between those who received the preferred article, which is the brown bar, and those who received the non-preferred articles. Those are pessimists, okay? But they became more pessimist, so they revised downward the less if they receive the articles that they liked, which is the pessimistic one. Okay, and if you go through those panels, you basically will see the same consistent message. Now, let me also tell you, of course, in more modern experiments also check that what people are telling them, what people are telling the researchers is actually true, and it's going to be confirmed by intended behavior and by other incentivized measures where people, actually need to spend money. So here what we do is we regress a number of other variables that we think can be give a consistent message with the update of the beliefs. And so here we ask them whether they found the article informative. Here is the time that they spend on the article. Here is the money that they spend in order to have the article advertised on the website. Here is an headline check. So we put an attention check to see whether they were really interested in paying attention. And here is reliability. So whether they find, we ask them whether they find the article reliable. Now, again, what you see is that everybody who get the preferred article tends to find this article more informative. It spend more time. They spend more money advertising it. So really doing, kind of also advertising it to the others, and they find it more reliable. Now, let me specify and stress one thing at this point. By the way, the money that they spend advertising is a known, it's a significant one. For instance, they tend to spend $4.5 to add more to advertise. And this is a significant amount given that the average donation was $26. Now, I also want to mention one important thing at this stage. So column 1, where they find, they rate the article as more informative, can actually be consistent also with other theory of biases. So it can be consistent with rational inattention. It could be that the respondents had chosen the article because this was something in which they did not have information. They wanted to have the information. It was cheap. And then once they read it, they learned something and they rate the article as more informative. So this is a plausible theory. However, it's not consistent with many of the things we find. Most importantly, in this table, it's not consistent with the fact that those people also spend more money and they find it more reliable. Meaning that this is really something that happens if the article happens to be close to your feeling, so to speak, rather than you just found it more informative. Okay, last check to see whether all that respondents did was consistent. Here we regress the lockdown support and the donation to the WHO. As remember, the other organization is Freedom Work, so more of an optimist one, and WHO is the pessimist one. Okay, so here again, the coefficient of interest is the interaction term between whether the respondents had chosen the pessimistic article and whether they received the preferred ones. Again, this positively and significantly predict that they want to support lockdown even more, that they want to donate money to the WHO as opposed to Freedom Work. And again, the amount of money is not negligible because the increase is from $2.88 to $5.72. So again, this confirms sort of consistent behavior that whatever they choose and whatever they want to do tends to be very much consistent with their initial priors. And again, let me stress that this is across all type of demographics. So there are no other variables or no other type of theories that would be consistent with this sort of asymmetric updating. Here you see, same information from the previous table. Here you see visually with a non-parametric test. And I think this is easier to read because basically what it shows, people that had chosen the article in the health domain, whether they do more or less lockdown support. Again, the brown is the pessimist who had received the article that they like, and they tend to support lockdown even more than the ones, relatively to the ones that had not received the desired articles. Okay, same thing for the donation to the WHO. And same message comes out if we look at the people that had chosen the article in the economy domain. So they want to, they become more pessimist if they receive the assigned article. Okay, so let me go now to survey 2. So let me remind again that, the whole goal is to look at motivated beliefs where people have an incentive to hear what they like to hear. And typically this tends to be amplified in group, or in the case of choosing a media source, it's a sort of echo chamber. So you tend to choose, this is also partly consistent with cognitive dissonance, so people tend to choose for instance, media sources that tend to confirm what they like to hear. So it makes sense to extend the survey also to a second experimental design where we measure source dependence. So how much their update of beliefs and their intended behavior is going to be driven by a source that the respondents feel being aligned with their own thinking, as opposed to a source that they feel not being aligned. So the second survey, we have a representative sample in terms of age, education, gender, geography of 1,500 US households. Everything is similar to survey 1. So we collect demographics, priors and posteriors, very similar like in survey 1. Also policy preferences. However, what differs with respect to survey 1 is that here we randomize with respect to the source of the article, Fox News as opposed to New York Times being revealed. Here, to simplify the survey, we focus only on one domain. We don't ask them to choose different domain, but we give them 2 headlines which markedly differ in tone, one being pessimistic and one being optimistic. And again, we check the headline before in a pilot and in MTARC that the headlines are not one being catchier than the others. Okay, so the idea here is that, we don't randomize with respect to the tone. We give them their design tone, but we randomize with respect to whether the source is revealed at the beginning, is revealed before the choice of the article, or is revealed after the choice of the article and before the update of the posterior. Now, very key aspects of this survey. Number 1, we choose a pessimistic article from Fox News and an optimist article from New York Times. And the choice is not coincidental. So we really want to create a limiting scenario because, so most people would expect Fox News to have optimistic article. Okay, to foster Republican views about not wearing masks and, the machisto view that we can go out. And we tend to think of New York Times as being the pessimist, more liberal Democrat. Okay, so why we choose one pessimist? It was very hard. We had to read quite many articles. Why we choose this one? Because we really wanted to be counterintuitive. So we really want to create the situation in which the respondents enters in contradiction with his own beliefs. And in this case, we can really see how much the source alignment tends to impact his own beliefs updating or his own choice of the article. Okay, so consider the example, which I think for me is always very intuitive, but probably also it will become more clear during the results. So imagine that there is a pessimist, liberal, that wants to vote Biden. Okay, so this person is very, very likely across all dimensions to wanting to choose a pessimistic article. And the pessimistic article, remember, is the one from Fox News. Okay, so what happens to what we want to know is what happens to this guy once we tell him that the article that he would have loved to read is from Fox News. Okay, if we see that this guy is so outraged that he decides not to choose this article, or that once he reads this article, he finds it less reliable or updates less in the direction of pessimist, then we will really have selected a case where source matters even more than your own prior. Okay, and the reason is basically because source is something that people have chosen at the beginning to belong to, and so it's some sort of thinking that you want to be consistent across your own life. Okay. So let me give again a description of the design through the schematic. So at stage 0, we elicit the priors. Those are like the ones before, so I don't need to tell them to you again. Then we randomize. So to 1/3 of the people, we tell the source. Okay, and we show them their preferred article. To 2/3 of the people, we let them. We elicit their beliefs. We let them choose the article, and we show the preferred article, and then we randomize again. So to some of them, we show, to half of them we show the article source, and to the other half we don't show the article source. Let me explain now, like before, what is the idea here. So, so some people are told the source from the beginning, okay? Now we want a group of people that is told the source before choosing. And so we want to see the impact of telling the source before you choose. So imagine again the respondent that I devised before. So this liberal pessimist vote inviter, we tell them that we tell him that the source is Fox News. He might decide not to read this article, despite the article is a pessimistic one. Okay, and the revelation after the choice serves for us to look at what is the impact of the source on the update of the belief or on the incentivized behavior. Okay, if you tend to choose, if you tend to update your belief in a direction that is contrary to your initial prior, simply because you learn about the source. Okay, now here are the results. So first of all, preliminaries. Before going and having a look at what happens in the randomization, we want to make sure that this survey is consistent. Okay, perfect. So this time I hit the right time. Okay, so before looking at the impact of the source, how we randomize the source on the beliefs and the behavior, let me give you some preliminary. So we want to check whether this survey has respondents have a behavior that is consistent with the previous survey, which is what we would like to have, basically. So here we select only the group of people that were never revealed the source, okay? So this group of people should behave like in our previous survey, because in our previous survey, we didn't reveal the source, okay? And what we check is whether the fact that those people were more worried to start with, so they were more pessimist to start with, increases the likelihood that they are going to choose the pessimistic article. And the answer is yes. So those people believe as we expected before them to believe. So if they are more pessimist, they tend to choose the more pessimistic article. So if they behave like this, then the question is, what happens once we reveal them the source? What kind of contradiction they enter in with, okay? So here the varium column, the table is not easy to read, but bear with me. So here the varium columns are basically interacting the initial belief, the prior belief, the fact that the respondent is a pessimist, with the fact that the source is revealed. Now, if we know that this pessimist would more likely to read the pessimistic article. However, at some stage, we tell him that the pessimistic article is from Fox News. And what happens is that when we tell him so, he's less likely to choose the pessimistic article, despite him being a pessimist. Okay. Same thing, we see the same consistent message when instead of measuring the priors through the worries, we measure the priors to the principal component, or whether we measure it through the lockdown. But even more strikingly, here we interact the fact that this pessimist is also a liberal, and he would have definitely liked to choose the pessimistic article or to read the pessimistic article, but the moment that he learns that the pessimistic article is coming from Fox News, he has a minus 24.99 significant coefficient of not choosing the pessimistic article. And those results are quite striking because you have to think that here the only randomization is done basically on the source. That is okay. Now, last thing. Well, before the last thing, let me show you again visually the information that you have in this table. You can see it visually again here, where we rank our respondents according to quintiles of their prior beliefs, okay, from lowest pessimist to the highest pessimist. Like before, we see that the highest pessimists tend to more likely choose the pessimistic article, but there is a very strong difference because the pessimist liberal that is told that the article is from Fox News, so the green bar, is much less likely to choose the pessimistic article than the liberal pessimist that is not told that this is from Fox News, okay? Okay, last thing, how is source going to affect the belief update and the behavioral measures? Okay, so here we show visually the belief update is here. So here is the update of the probability of death being larger than 200K. And in all the other panels is the behavioral measures or intended behavior that we also discussed before. So whether the respondents found the article more reliable, whether they found it more informative, whether they want to spend more money in advertising it, whether they are more attentive, and whether they want to support lockdown even more. Now, what we do here is to create a surprise measure, because again, remember that the key thing is the source is going to have an impact on the people that are going to be most surprised. If they follow the source despite being very surprised, then they really align with this sort of clan. Okay, so what you see here is that we divide the red one is low surprised and the blue one is high surprised. And exactly as we expected, the blue ones are the ones that are going to be more source dependent. So for instance, the people that tend to be more surprised, so again, the example of the pessimist liberal is the perfect one. So the pessimist liberal that tend to be more surprised about this coming from Fox News ends up finding the article less reliable, despite the fact that the article was pessimist. So he would have liked the article, but he finds it less reliable when he learns that it's from Fox News, and he's most surprised from this. He finds it less informative. He ends up spending less money in advertising, and he ends up being less attentive and somehow to revise more. Okay. Okay, so I guess this is basically it also for the second survey. So let me wrap up. So as I argued at the beginning, we did this information experiment. Key things are the fact that it was done during a large shock. So it's very rare to have the conditions for which you can measure this. I mean, a very large health shock with a lot of uncertainty, and for people being hungry for news and really wanted to select something that is close to their own beliefs. They want to confirm what they like. There is an endogenous choice of information, which it's quite rare in this type of information experiments, but it's very crucial when you want to measure motivated beliefs. And we do randomization across several dimensions in the two different surveys, and we think we find very strong evidence in favor of this more nuanced variant of the motivated belief, which is confirmatory biases. Again, we want to stress that it's not that people are consistently being optimist or consistently being pessimist. They just update more in the direction of their desired signals. And last but not least, we think that this is a very important area for the reason I mentioned at the beginning, because policymakers can nudge through communication the incentives of people in the right direction.
Okay, thank you very much, Esther, for this very clear and interesting presentation. So the discussant is Michael Thaler from Princeton.
Thank you for inviting me to discuss the paper. Thank you, Esther, for a great talk. I thought this was a really interesting and timely paper, and I'm very happy to be discussing it. So I think there's two sets of contributions of the paper. One in kind of the more narrow but burgeoning space of papers on COVID-19, but also kind of the more general implications for belief updating and information acquisition. So the way I see it, the paper looks at whether people prefer to see optimistic or pessimistic articles about COVID, and then how they update their beliefs. And people actually, the baseline is not that different between optimists and pessimists, but there's these sizable heterogeneities by current beliefs and by politics, wherein optimists prefer optimistic news and pessimists prefer pessimistic news. And then when you label in survey 2, the optimistic or pessimistic news as the opposite of kind of what the media typically report, the ideology of the source seems to swamp the effect of optimism in general. So I really liked, I thought the survey experiment was done very carefully. There were kind of enormous samples. It was over 2,000 in the first one, over 1,500 in the second. They were representative. I thought it was very good that they tested both demand for info and inference kind of in the same experiment. And I thought the incentives were good too. I liked especially the Facebook ads as the incentives. And I thought the implications for kind of COVID news was pretty interesting. People are not looking for reassuring news. They're just looking for news that confirms their priors. And also, I'll talk about this a little bit more later. But I thought it was especially interesting that the perceptions of the health implications and the economic implications weren't substitutes, which is actually what I went into the paper thinking they would be. So in some of these cases, like donation decisions, they were complements. So greater pessimism about unemployment, pessimistic news about the economy led, not surprisingly, to greater pessimism at unemployment, but actually greater donations to the WHO, whereas you might think that Freedom Works would propose policies that are more important about employment. And the pure correlation between the worries that people had about health and economy were very small. So it might not be the kind of common discussion of just a jobs versus virus spread trade-off that we often see. It also, I think, we saw that choice of news leads to more distorted and polarized public health beliefs in many of these cases. Okay. But I think it's even arguably more interesting kind of from a basic science perspective of how people are consuming news more broadly. There's this growing set of evidence that people are seeking out prior confirming news, and also that they're inferring more from it. And it's good to see that this is the case here when the stakes are pretty high, when it's about health. And I think it's also interesting to better understand that some form of motivated beliefs and motivated reasoning seems to be at play here. And I think it's especially interesting to think about what beliefs are people motivated to hold about a very severe negative shock to the world. And I actually like to see even more of a discussion about how we can tease apart different mechanisms, such as motivated reasoning, confirmation bias, and certain forms of Bayesian updating when people come in with heterogeneous priors. So for instance, I think the following story is possible, and I don't know if it would drive the results, but it could be a candidate explanation. You imagine people, they're optimists and pessimists. The optimist believes that news is generally biased towards overstating the impact of COVID on health and the economy. She's going to demand news she thinks is more informative, which here is optimistic news. So the optimistic headline is the article she wants to read because she thinks it's more informative. She does indeed find this optimistic news more persuasive because for the same reasons that she became an optimist in the first place. And the pessimist does the exact opposite. And this could interact with confirmation bias for motivated reasoning. It could also be at play on its own. And I think it could help also to have kind of a simple toy model in the background to better understand which parameters we're looking at. So here's kind of a simple belief updating model that's been used in a lot of papers since, I want to say, the 80s. So subject has some prior pi sub I about, let's say, COVID deaths, whether they'll be high above 200,000 or low. And I receives one of the articles. Suppose I receives the optimistic article, and we're going to define a logit function as being log of some probability minus log of 1 minus the probability. We'll get that the logit posterior is equal to alpha times logit prior plus beta times the relative log likelihood of seeing the optimistic article in state high versus the optimistic article in state low, plus maybe something with motivated beliefs. So what a Bayesian would do is a Bayesian would set alpha equal 1, beta equals 1, gamma equals 0. So the logit posterior is equal to the logit prior plus this relative log likelihood signal term. Confirmation bias person would have alpha greater than 1. If agents ignored information or forgot it, beta would be less than 1. Motivated reasoning could say that gamma is greater than 0. And a lot of the kind of differences in source trust would come through this signal term. So we might think that, if two agents just differ on if they trust optimistic sources or find more persuasive optimistic versus pessimistic sources, it would come through here. So I think this is probably too much because I think it's pretty hard to identify all of these things, but just teasing apart which of these stories seems to pertain to alpha greater than 1 versus gamma greater than 0 versus the signal likelihood being different, I think would be interesting. And I think the literature has talked about some of these explanations, but not quite, definitely not in this environment, but also not quite as structured as I think this paper could also do. So I think, like, for instance, a clear test of confirmation bias is we look at the correlation between the logit priors and then the logit belief updating process. I think this seems true given the data in survey 1. And if there's a way to test a law of iterated expectations, I'm not sure if you have these kind of perceived log likelihoods in the data, but if you could rule out Bayes' rule in this way as well. And I think demand for news probably follows a similar pattern. So it seems like this is in the experiment largely driven by inference. So it seems like people who demand optimistic news more genuinely believe it's more informative, and vice versa for pessimists. And this may be reflected in the priors. The other thing I thought was really interesting is what types of beliefs people are actually motivated to hold here. Because this was another thing that I actually thought was very not obvious to me going in, and I thought the results were actually really impactful because of that. So in particular, the paper finds no evidence of wishful thinking in general of positive events. And I think the literature is mixed on this, and I think this actually answers a pretty important question. So for instance, we might think that people would be motivated to believe that things are good, and that there will be not that many deaths from COVID, that unemployment won't be that high. And I think the past evidence, there's kind of an older literature going back to Weinstein 1980, which shows that there is some evidence of wishful thinking about future life events in specific domains that are about yourself. So your future health, future well-being, future income. I have an experiment which shows that it doesn't happen in domains that are purely about other people. And here it's kind of a mixed domain, and one that I think my prior would be very pertinent to myself, because if I think that 20% of people are going to be unemployed, that is very likely to pertain to me or people I care about. So I think this is a big, actually, an understated contribution of the paper is to say that the public health emergency seems to be in this others domain more than this health domain. But the paper does find a lot of evidence for prior confirming and politics confirming motivated beliefs, which suggests that things like identity and prior shape motivated beliefs a bit more than these concerns about the world. And I think that the model here, if you thought it was useful to include, could also disentangle the different psychologies as well. So switching gears, I think one of the things that I thought was, as I mentioned at the beginning, really interesting, but I had a little trouble interpreting, was what we mean when it's health versus economic optimism. So in particular, the charities, I thought they serve very different purposes. Obviously, the WHO is going to be more pro-lockdown. FreedomWorks is going to be, more against lockdown. But I would have actually thought ex ante that FreedomWorks would be more concerned about economic ramifications, and maybe correlated with more economic anxiety, and WHO about health anxiety. It's unclear if that's actually the case. I don't know what people's perceptions of that are, but it didn't seem like in the data the causal effects point in that direction. It seemed like it was more an overall level of optimism or pessimism, which seems to be more correlated with politics here. The other thing is the choice of domain subjects saw was actually their choice, so it was not randomized. unless the optimism and pessimism was, but the domain wasn't. So I would have liked a little bit of a discussion for how this could affect estimates. If we're grouping subjects into those who prefer economic news versus prefer health news, how does this relate to their overall levels of optimism? Pessimism, how does it correlate with other variables? For instance, maybe in the US, Democrats care more about health concerns, Republicans care more about economic concerns. I had some smaller comments that I will briefly say, but I'll send you the slides, so they'll be there too. I thought it was interesting that there was kind of an overall pessimism effect, in that the average effect seemed to be pessimistic, both in the belief updating and the donation decisions, and that it went more to the WHO. And I didn't really know what to make of this in general. It didn't seem like there was overall pessimistic motivated reasoning, but the belief updating pointed in that direction. I was wondering why the authors chose to just do Fox and pessimism versus New York Times and optimism instead of the full 2x2 to look at the partial impact. But these are kind of minor comments. Also, I think the effects were really strong and really statistically significant. They did, however, move around a little bit with controls, which is expected. If you control for politics, you should expect these things to be affected. But I think I would have played around just kind of in an appendix with more sets of controls, maybe a finer set of controls about party as well. Another very minor comment is subjects in the bottom 10% of time spent were omitted from the analyses. I think there's a lot of good reasons for this. The authors were very clear and upfront about it. I don't expect, given how strong the results were, it would affect things, but I just have a brief discussion of what happens when they're included. Anyway, so I'll wrap up and say I think this was a really well done experiment with very strong results, very large sample, representative, and very timely. And I think it pretty clearly showed that people were demanding like-minded news about COVID. They were inferring more from like-minded news about COVID. And there wasn't evidence for wishful thinking in general. It was really about priors and politics. And that I thought it was very interesting that the politics really dominated the prior. So once you label news, that seems to swamp all the effects and reverse it in these kind of surprising cases. And I think the paper could be even stronger if there were more discussion of the theory and psychology underlying the demand and inference for news in kind of this broader space. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to hear the further discussion about it.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much for your discussion. Esther, would you like to respond briefly?
Yes, I mean, actually, my co-authors are in the audience, as I mentioned before. So I'm going to, respond briefly, and then it would be great if they want to add something. I mean, we really spend a lot of effort and enthusiasm into that, so maybe they want to say something. So first of all, Michael, this was a great discussion. I mean, one can really tell that you have been thinking about this quite long and in a very, very refined way. So we have been really lucky to have you as a discussant. And I know you also last year from Harvard, you are a very constructive gentleman. So I like the discussion very much. So thanks a lot. And we look forward also to receive the slides. Now, let me respond. There were tons of incredibly useful comments. First of all, I mean, I'm happy that you said that we should put a toy model, because this is something that I like very much. And I think, I mean, actually, your model is really simple and elegant. And so, I mean, this is a great suggestion. We should definitely do it. Now, on the Bayesian updated versus motivated belief. I mean, obviously, this is somehow a common question, right? Is this rational or not? But I mean, I understand that you said we should expand more this discussion. I think there are many elements that go in the direction of motivated beliefs. I mean, as I said before in the table, the fact that the agents find those articles even more reliable and not only more informative. And more to the point of the example that you made, you said, well, maybe I am an optimist because, and I want to have information about optimism. And so I choose that article. So this is a plausible event, meaning with positive probability, but I find it very unlikely, because if I'm really choosing an article based on doubts that I have, then there wouldn't be a reason for me being optimist in the first place. If I am an optimist and I became so because of this information, probably I have already selected information. The other thing is that what we checked, but we should probably stress more, and we're definitely going to make your example and to check further into that, is that we don't see consistent, determinants like, you being more educated or more educated in a certain domain and so on and so forth. So it seems that really the driving force is your prior belief, rather than your expertise, rather than you being exposed more or less to risk. Okay, I think the other very fundamental point that you made was this complementarity between health and economics that we find basically more or less in all regressions, except the first one when they choose the article. We were actually also very, I think all of us, we were actually also very surprised at the beginning, because, during the pandemic, you hear all economists talking about trade-off between economics and health. And then you ask normal people and they don't think about this way. There were tons of research on the trade-off between health and economics, but the people in the street, they were just worried whether about health and economics, equally worried about. So you can think of this can be explained in many ways. I think Andreas would push for simple heuristics. You're just worried about everything and you don't really make a distinction, right? So we can check further what you mentioned, whether, people that tend to support more WHO, maybe they had relatively more anxiety in health as opposed to economics. This is plausible. But generally speaking, we had already done quite many checks and there seemed to be quite much complementarity. I look forward to check your slides for more detailed comments, but I don't know if my co-authors want to add something.
Maybe one thing. Hi. Thanks very much, Michael. This was extremely useful discussion. So in terms of the Bayesian model versus motivated beliefs, one thing we do in the paper and that we're not stressing very much yet is that we tried to do an instrumental variable analysis as well, where we use whether somebody lost their job due to the pandemic as an instrument for how strongly they worry about the economic aspects, and then how many health conditions that they have that make them more susceptible to an infection for an instrument as to how much they worry about the health aspect. And I think we actually took the health conditions from your paper with Matt and co-authors. And there we do find that, if you use that as an instrument for the two worries, that does seem to have a causal effect as well. So it's not, in that sense, it's not just a correlation. It does seem to have sort of this causal aspect that goes more in the direction of motivated beliefs in our opinion. But I totally agree that we should frame it better within a model and sort of have the competing explanations. So thanks again.
Yeah, I really like the IV approach. That sounds like a great addition.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So we can open now the discussion to all participants. We have about 15 minutes. Are there general questions? So maybe I'll start by asking a question. So I guess there are two views, right? When you get news from the opposite side, if I may say so. One view is you don't trust them, so you discount what they say. The other view is, well, if they say it, if they provide me information which is contrary to the usual views, maybe this information will be correct, right? So you clearly seem to find evidence of the former, right, rather than the latter. Do you think it's specific to the US context, or do you think this would apply, that your finding would apply in a less polarized society equally well?
Okay, so yeah, well, that's a great point. Two things. We don't, so this one thing, which I think is reassuring, we don't find consistent statement of Fox being less reliable, which, you know, might imply that, you know, what we see is not really, again, choosing your echo chamber, but it's really like Fox is unreliable. And so that's it, you know, we find it less reliable. We don't find this, and I think this is reassuring. Now, your question is whether this would apply. I mean, there is, you know, in this expanding area of experiments, of course, there is this issue of doing it across societies. Because, yeah, well, I think many of us are reading this weird book those days, but of Joseph Enrich, that makes this point that it has to be done across different type of ethnic groups and different type of societies, because all the biases that we see in experiments for Western people might not apply generally, and all the biases that we see for Americans might not apply to French. That's a very valid point. And yeah, I mean, that definitely should be done at some point. If we had more money, probably we would have done it across across countries. But yeah, it definitely should to test it further, it should go in that direction. Andreas, Basit, anything to add on this?
So yeah, maybe I can jump in on this. Hi everybody. So we have a result which goes a bit in the direction of your of the second story you were talking about. So in the second survey, we basically find that if you look at lockdown support, what happens is that if you are a liberal and you learn that the pessimistic article comes from Fox News, you actually end up being more in favor of lockdown policies, which is a result that puzzled us a bit, but I think goes exactly in the direction of your story. So if you think that this source is very biased, once you learn that it has unexpected views, you end up even reinforcing your point of view. So, you have I think that's a bit what you have in mind here.
Yeah, thank you. Are there other questions?
Yes, I have a question, if I may. Hi, Esther. Really nice presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. I mean, linking also to what just Vincenzo said, how do you distinguish this behavior of the agent with respect to what it could be caused by what is known as cognitive dissonance? Can't it be cognitive dissonance, an example of cognitive dissonance in this case, in this instance that is taking place?
So yes, I mean, let me put it this way. So there are many, as I said at the beginning, there are many variants of motivated beliefs. And as you said, one of it is cognitive dissonance, which is like over your life, you consistently choose signals that confirm your choices. No? So we definitely want to, as also Michael said, we definitely want to distinguish between two broad categories. So for instance, wishful thinking that implies consistent choice of optimist signals, and other variants that imply the asymmetric updating, but don't have a consistent think, either in denial or. But it is plausible that cognitive dissonance is part of this asymmetric updating, particularly in the second survey. I mean, Andreas. Yeah. Yes, Andreas had mentioned, so the second, I don't think we want to distinguish this, but the second survey, you can read it either that you are, you want to align with people of Fox News, so it's some sort of group thinking, but you can also read it as, I've chosen Fox News as my lifelong thinking. Yeah. And so if at some point, and I believe they're going to tell me something optimist, but if at some point they tell me something different, I simply conclude that, well, maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but Fox News must be right because this is what I've chosen to believe at the beginning. So yes, that's one plausible explanation. We should probably put it in the paper. It's not in contradiction with the main finding that, again.
No, absolutely, but it can be something that reinforces your findings.
It's a plausible alternative explanation of the second survey. And it's definitely interesting question for future research to refine those variants even further, so to speak, whether it's more group thinking, so more some sort of primitive attitude, or it's more like cognitive dissonance, which might be more of highly educated people that want to confirm their dogmas. Yeah,
they want to be consistent with their attitude in their attitude system.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, but indeed, the researchers and academics tend to have the biggest cognitive dissonance ever.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
This is not genuine mistakes. I mean, this is like intentional selection. Absolutely.
But anyway, the paper is really interesting, really nice.
Thanks a lot.
If there are more questions, of course, the discussion can continue offline. All right, so let me make. We're gonna, I guess, close the session. So the next, I'd like to make an announcement. So the next seminar will be held on Tuesday, January 12th. Nicola Gennaioli from Bocconi will present a paper on the perception of COVID risk. And the discussion will be conducted by Rolly Heimer from Boston College. In the meantime, Kim, Roman, and I would like to wish you a great holiday season, and we look forward to seeing you in the new year. So thank you again to all the participants today, and especially to Esther and Michael. Thank you very much.